Good evening, all. My name is Alfy Olufade, and I'd like to thank you guys for kind of participating in today's National Fellow Online Lecture Series. Once again, this event or this lecture series is sponsored by AMSSM Fellows Online Education Subcommittee, the AMSSM Education Committee, as well as the AMSSM Fellowship Committee. It's with great pleasure that I'm having a friend of mine, a colleague, Dr. Matt Sedgley, present. I've known Matt for about 15 years now as a resident interviewing at his program, and I'm excited to be working with him as colleagues this past decade or so. The topic we'll be discussing today is mass event coverage. Just a heads up, the next upcoming lecture is going to be sports economics talk. And this is going to be Dr. Elliot Hu, as well as Dr. Sela Portugal, who's going to be moderating that particular session on October 1st, 2025. Just a reminder in terms of the purpose of this talk, the purpose of this is to serve as an adjunct to individual programs, educational programming, provide fellows with direct access to educational experiences with experienced AMSSM members, and at times have some guest experts that will be presenting. And lastly, but not the least, to assist in CAQ exam preparations. A couple of housekeeping rules. Please remember to mute your devices and turn off the video. Submit your questions through the chat function. If you wish to, include your name and the program that you are. I, as a moderator, will be taking on the Q&A sessions and kind of asking the questions after Dr. Sedgley is done with the talk. After the program, please encourage us, show us one of the things that we could do better, and fill out some of the evaluation form that we will have. The link is going to be sent on the chat, so please fill that out. So I will stop my sharing now, and excited to have Dr. Sedgley present today.
Going to start off. I'm Dr. Sedgley. I know Alfy did a great job introducing me, but we've known each other a long time, and I'm excited tonight to talk to you about this topic of just coverage of mass participation events. And I myself am at MedStar Health in Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area, the director of running medicine, and I'm also the co-director of emergency action planning. So this is something I've been doing since I was an intern. When someone said, "Hey, what are you doing this weekend?" And I said, "Well, this is one of the weekends I'm not working." And they said, "Would you like to help with the Twin Cities Marathon?" And I think the rest is history. I think I've covered close to 3 dozen marathons, and really just had a really fun time trying to learn more about this topic. So we're going to be sharing that with you this evening. Andy, why don't you jump to the next slide? Go to the one with the disclaimer for me real quick, just if you don't mind. Just for a disclaimer, I don't have any disclaimers, no conflict of interest for myself or my family. So we want to talk today about essentially the mass participation coverage, and it really comes from a consensus statement. So remember, the consensus statement has a conference, and they bring together just world experts, and they make recommendations. But this was not the first time they did this. The initial one was almost 20 some years ago. And the question is, why do an update? Why was this done? This is mainly due to the fact that mass participation events have changed. And probably the biggest change is the importance, really, in my opinion, I'm biased, but the development of an emergency action plan, or EAP, and then practicing it. This is not going to be a lecture on emergency action plans, although we could do that in the future. But they're going to have to be touched base on this topic. And this particular consensus statement on how to address things is really valuable because it touches on a lot of different topics in sports medicine. But it's not just that EAPs are important. Consider the following things. For a lot of mass gathering events, the recent growth has been driven by younger athletes, more female participants, and really reversed a pre-pandemic aging trend. The participants are much more diverse, and they themselves are seeking variety, or the majority of participants hunting for new events. They're longer, they're faster, they're more challenging and more intense. And really the world has changed since the last consensus statement. And so technology and safety have really been revolutionized. there was no real social media presence back then when the first statement came out. And technology has really let us track entries into these events. And remember, this is not just marathons. This could be like tournaments for baseball, softball. This could be Nordic skiing. Safety and tracking are real time, and weather's monitoring is real time. And so there's really not an excuse if you're the medical team to say, I don't know where your partner you ran with was, or I had no idea what the weather was going to be. Um, Also recall that participant experience has changed a little bit. They're looking for more supportive and inclusive environments. They're welcoming more first timers to these mass events, and that's great. I think we should lower the barriers to race fitness in our society. But that doesn't mean every single person at your event is going to be well trained for it on a hot, humid day, perhaps for an ultra marathon. And I think the event organizations are trying to give events of quality and value. But that's going to also mean, I think, coming with it, any response you have to a problem is going to have a level of scrutiny and definitely be shared on social media potentially. And the last thing I think that's changed in this world, and Andy, if you'll hit the tab a few times to show some of the things pop up here, is security on a large scale. The first TPCC on mass gathering was in 2004. So the Boston Marathon bombing was April 15th, 2013. This occurred and really has changed the security environment forever. And so your EAP that you develop may be proprietary and confidential. So let's kind of dive into this here a bit. On this slide, I'm going to use the organization of the consensus statement. I'll sometimes just call it the update since it's a very long term. But the update starts with EAP or emergency action plans, goes into what you should think about as a sports medicine doctor pre-event, during an event, and post-event. And then it also discusses things like equipment, environmental safety, and other topics. Now, remember, when you have a consensus statement, they're bringing together these world experts. They make general recommendations, and they break it down into essential or desired topics. And so these statements that are essential really are the information that every and any team physician must be responsible for understanding. Whereas the desirable statements are those that in an ideal setting, where every resource is available, you should strive for. And so the outline of the paper kind of looks at these topics. Andy, why don't you slide to the next slide for us here, and we'll talk about the list of topics we have as we hit them. But really think about this. Who do you serve? Many of us are used to caring for athletes, and mass participation events have athletes, but they often come in communities, in areas with spectators. So where I practice, there's often a division of labor, who's taking care of like the NFL players on the field, who's taking care of the spectators in the bowl, and then who's taking care of the community right outside of that stadium area. But that world can collide and become connected. We've probably seen in the news recently, or recall a baseball fan fell from the field, the stands down onto the field. Or, recently we had a football fan at one of our dozens of colleges we cover. They're in the parking lot and they're having a heart attack. They have sudden cardiac arrest. Is that the job of people taking care of the team? Probably not on a football stadium, but what if you're at a marathon? You just can't call 911. And so keep in mind that I think if you put up that red flag and it says first aid, people may find you that's not your athletes in a mass participation event. Right? We had a marathon tent up a few years ago where we had a stroke patient walk in, and they made it very clear they saw the first aid station sign, and they knew there was help there. We also had 3 people with broken ankles from that marathon, and none of them were runners. I think ethically you're bound to decide what to do, and I think the correct thing is always to take care of the patient. But with the specialized knowledge you have as a sports physician, you have to take care of your athletes and community sometimes at the same time. Andy, if you'll hit a button and pull up 2 or 3 of these points, was actually a New England Journal study. And it actually went on weeks where there was a marathon, there was actually a longer time for ambulance transport in the community. And that the 30-day mortality was higher for those hospitalized. And they controlled for smoking and diabetes. So this wasn't a selection bias. And so while this study is separate from the TPCC 2022 update, Again, it proves the important role you have as a team physician to protect your community and not just your athletes. And so some of the discussions you'll have on safety will include what requirements your municipality may need. If you put on a massive lacrosse tournament, in Washington, D.C., they actually require ALS ambulances at any race where they call a first aid tent a first aid tent. That may not be the case in your city, but you may also have to just be comfortable liaising with local fire, EMS, police, federal organizations like ATF, FBI. And pre-race, you need to answer the questions. When do I need an ALS ambulance? When do I need a BLS ambulance? Because we know that every few minutes that pass, mortality increases by 7 to 10% for sudden cardiac arrest. And we have to be prepared for that. So pre-event, you can make a big difference. And I think the take-home message I'm trying to share this evening is you can't have your EAP be that you're going to call 911. That's not an action plan. And those first 5 or 10 minutes when you have an athlete that needs help can make a huge difference before help arrives. And do you want to move forward? We'll do the next slide. Next slide. All right. So again, we could have a very long conversation on emergency action plans, but I think it's essential to understand why they were focused upon in this update. What is an EAP? I mean, technically, it's a well-written, comprehensive document that outlines the necessary preparations for on-site response procedures for catastrophic injuries or just injuries you're going to see in your setting. And that's usually developed by a multidisciplinary team. For us, we use our athletic trainers, physical therapists, our sports medicine specialists, and our orthopedists to come together with our EMS personnel, emergency medicine experts. And we were trying to make sure that we have a prompt, effective response to any type of emergency or problem. Now, there's different definitions of EAPs out there. Some are from the NATA, others are from OSHA, and I don't think they have to be necessarily exclusive. And when you're trying to build the components of an EAP on this slide, which we won't read to you per se, but you need to think about these things and put them in perspective that if you are going to build something, it has to include these components. I will say the one thing I want to just touch base on is that many times EAPs must be venue specific. So you could have a lacrosse tournament going on the field hockey field, the football field, the lacrosse field, if you have multiple folks at a university. And that's the venue, but it's also sports specific because on a different date, you might have 3 different sports going on at those same locations. And typically we'll try to build our EAPs to even be condition and athlete specific when we can, although that's a different point. We'll get to it later. So as we mentioned, the key reasons that the update was made was really emergency action plans. And so, Andy, if you can go to the next slide for us. I've taken these slides, and if you listen to this later on YouTube or you want to, listen to it at 1.5 speed as you're working out later to review it, anything you see that's a red box is going to be one of the essential recommendations from the update. And so you can see that they have made some recommendations on emergency action plans. If you're the team physician or event physician, you must participate in the development and reviewing of the EAP. And that includes getting the medical protocols right for that event and that venue. And then if you're the medical director, getting that medical team together. And of course, it's your responsibility not just to build an EAP, but share it with others. So I always talk to people about like the important things you have to do. And the ones that you're going to see on this entire slide deck, if it's red, that's an essential recommendation. Let's go to the next slide, Andy. And then pull up the 2 pictures if you wouldn't mind. So for us, we actually review our EAPs yearly for a lot of our events, but in the state of Maryland where I practice, there's a state law for high schools. We have to practice our EAPs every season. So that means that you're doing, your fall for winter and then your spring, and you're doing it over and over again. And it's great because, pre-event is a great time to have a conversation about a problem. You can imagine if you're having a massive thunderstorm, there's lightning, that's not a great time to discover we don't know where we're going to shelter. So your EAPs, whether it's for your high schools or what have you, find out what needs to be done locally. But for mass gatherings, your EAP should be reviewed and updated and practiced as part of your pre-event planning. And I think this is similar to when we say we're going to have a medical timeout, which is a term I think coined by Corey Stringer Institute. that they'll recommend before high school games, but we want to start like thinking ahead of the game before your event, and your EAP has to be made available to the event medical personnel and their key administrators too. You can't just spring it on them and say, this is what we're going to do. You have to talk through what is expected. And many times that means you're taking also members of your team and making sure they're being trained on some very basic things, whether that's CPR or using an AED or just how to recognize emergency situations. Let's do the next slide. For the recommendations, again, anything that is in red, we're going to see here as an essential thing. Anything that's in blue is desired. And so understanding the scope of your event, understand and prepare the EAP and medical protocols, and then maintain your CPR certification, all essential. You don't have to begin from zero here. World Athletics, Fran O'Connor's group with the Marine Corps Marathon and others, Corey Stringer Institute, all world experts on how to have medical protocols and EAPs implemented. You don't have to start from zero. They've built them. You can actually use them as templates. They're free use at the World Athletics and Marine Corps Marathon Champs website. Beg, borrow, steal, and then make sure it fits your actual event. I think that when you look at the last essential thing on the pre-event, it says maintain CPR certification. We're really lucky to have some good emergency medicine literature. There's a study called OPALS, OPALS, and it's a study that clearly demonstrated that survival to hospital discharge after, for example, out of hospital cardiac arrest was significantly improved after three things happened: a rapid EMS response, quick CPR, and early defibrillation where it's necessary. So that can inform you like what really matters. And we know that's going to be hands-only CPR and where appropriate electricity, but you can't do that if your team that you've gathered isn't certified. And then I think desired, we want to like look at the event history and then participate in that EAP development and medical protocols. And people say, well, okay, what do you mean by reviewing the event history? Think about just the Boston Marathon for a moment. In 2017, there was 24 heat strokes just in tent A, right at the finish line. And then the very next year, it was so cold and rainy, there was nothing but hyponatremia. And I had a patient that had a core temperature of 83 Fahrenheit. You got to know what the past is. You can't always know what the future is, but you have to be at least understanding of what could happen. A lot of this development happens 6 to 12 months before your event, whether it's a tournament or what have you. So you got to be prepared. Andy, let's do the next slide. So yeah, you're probably not going to know the future. If you did, you'd probably be playing the lottery or doing something like that. But I think we really have to be sensitive to the fact that you can't know the future, no matter how much you prepare. But that's no excuse not to take the pulse of what you're going to do. And so as you prepare for your event, being familiar with your event is helpful. There's limits to what you can know, but you can see on the left of this slide, there's a wet bulb globe thermistor. You can always look at air quality. There's a lot of ways to try to divine what you may face. And I think the update really asks us to gather that prior event history. Whether that's a baseball or field hockey or soccer tournament, there's really no excuse not to ask, what's the coldest or the warmest it could be. Next slide. So when we look at desired pre-event things, they go on to not only ask about participate in development of the EAP and medical protocols, but also to work with your administrators. And I can't emphasize enough, having difficult conversations in the moment is hard. And so if you can actually just talk to your race director, find your fire EMS director, get them to talk about when are we going to start this race and why, very desirable. You can imagine starting a race in the middle of the afternoon in a hot, humid zone like Washington, D.C. would be a lot more difficult than if you could start at 6 a.m. And then Andy, pull up the pictures on this slide, if you wouldn't mind for 1 second. These two photos on this slide, the bottom one is actually a picture from the Lopit. After I graduated residency from the University of Minnesota, I volunteered at this race. It's a race, for those who don't know, with a first aid tent near a frozen lake. It is cold. It's just, that's what it is. And so you have to know the area. What's your area of egress, ingress, and how do you prepare for what you'll see and just make sure that area is ready to go. Top one is a picture of the Falmouth road race For those who don't know, this is on Cape Cod, and it's a very tiny town. I was able to shadow the medical director there this year. The emergency department there has about 2 to 3 beds. They have 10,000 runners. So you got to, confirm your area is ready to go and have a plan for that. Let's do the next slide. So again, can we know the future? No, not really. But we can certainly go to resources. This is a free web page we usually use for World Athletics called Weather Spark. So if someone came to you and said, I want you to be the medical director of a race, it's going to be a marathon in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm a millionaire and I'm going to pay you to put on this race. And I'd love to do it when the school's out. We'll do it in July. It'll be amazing. Maybe midday, the sun will be up. Well, I think, we can make recommendations to know how this mass participation event may go. Now, the benefit is probably people are going to be used to a little bit of heat and humidity and mugginess by the time it's July. But you might have someone fly in from, Maine who's just not used to that weather. So to know the scope of your event is key. And if you're the medical director, you have to really go a deeper dive and protect your athletes. And a word on being the medical director on this particular update on mass participation. The actual update will break out certain other recommendations. Let's do the next slide. If you are the medical director and you can go to the actual consensus statement, you'll see that they actually break out, say, okay, you're the medical director, you've got some additional things we're going to recommend. And so if you're serving as the medical director, the additional responsibilities include specifically to develop, review, and disseminate and get that EAP out to folks. Coordinate with your local EMS. You don't want to be pulling ambulances away from a community and then affecting heart attacks and strokes in that community. And then also just participating in the key decision making. It just really is part of the ecosystem we're in now. You can't be on the sidelines. And so these are key things that if you're the medical director and you're doing pre-event, essential recommendations. Next slide. Actually, can you go back one slide for me? There we go. So we have a photo here of our pre-event planning picture. Apologies to the University of Wisconsin for their loss this week to the University of Maryland Terps football team. But we did throw a little Easter egg out for you here on the slide. Dr. Sharon Swinkie, who's one of our EM physicians, went there. And if you look on the back left, we've got a little representation. There's no Bucky the Badger, but we can only do what we can do. But in this picture, you also see our head of nursing on the far left. We have our EM staff, Dr. Hudson. We got a heart there. Sharon's listening. We got Dr. Omley, who's the director of one of our hospitals right near the race. Dr. Kelly Ryan, myself. Sharon's not in the photo herself. She's taking it. But what are we doing here? We have a map of the entire marathon for the Baltimore Running Festival. And we're looking through our administrative plan and making sure we're actually fulfilling what they're recommending for our pre-race recommendations. So we're considering exactly where our tents will go, how many ambulances we need, and then we always make sure that we have medical liability coverage. You're not really a good Samaritan if you've been planning for 12 months to cover a marathon. And so all of our considerations we have for our pre-event planning, delineates EMS. Where's our incident command? Is it in the tent? Are we putting that in the operations command center down at City Hall? We just have to be ready for what we need to push forward this race. And if it's going to be a hot day, do we put more ice in the course? You can imagine preparation for this takes a lot of work, and it's a team effort. Next slide, please. So as we look at the events, that's all pre. Remember, the next chapter is going to be during. We talked about taking a medical timeout. Absolutely essential that you review the EAP. We just did that this week for our Baltimore Marathon coming up. And then enacting the medical protocols. You can't just say we're going to check a glucose on someone who's diabetic, who's confused, without getting the equipment you need. And then we always use a way of documenting our interaction. Now that could be paper and pen. We use an encrypted cloud-based app on our phone, but whatever you do, you have to maintain a medical record. That's just essential. I think that when you look at the first recommended medical timeout, we really steal that in some ways from our friends in surgery. There was that one study by Dr. Alex Haynes in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009. They just did a surgical safety checklist and their mortality went down, their complications went down. Our friends who fly airplanes do this too, right? Our friends in flight safety, they run a checklist. If you ever listen to like, the guy crashed the plane on the Hudson and saved everyone's life, they're like, hey, what's going on? They're like, we're running checklists. We're trying to avoid errors. And you can do that not just in a surgery or an aircraft, but actually at your event. So pausing your event before you start is a great way to be similar to those processes and very valuable for the similar reasons. Let's go ahead and do the next slide. So I'd like to point out here for just a moment, we've talked about algorithms. And again, why do I like talk about algorithms? I think it becomes easier if you've developed for your event day operations the guidelines ahead of time. And there are already evidence-based protocols out there from the groups I've mentioned previously, World Athletics, Champs with Marine Corps Marathon, Corey Stringer Institute. Think about what you get when you do your algorithms ahead of time. You get improved outcomes because you have a structured triage. You have treatment pathways for common problems. In this case, it's the marathon, but it could be for a Nordic ski race. It could be for an ultra marathon. It could be tennis tournament. You just have to know ahead of time what you're going to see. And for marathons, that's things like heat stroke, hyponatremia, and other things. And you get consistency of care and efficient medical use of your resources. And then it's easy for you to push this out with education and training. And I think in general, it will enhance the safety of your event if you can think of these protocols ahead of time. And they're adaptable. You can look at this and say, well, that doesn't really fit what I need. But the reality is like you can tweak them, but you don't have to start from zero. Andy, let's do the next slide. So we have also during mass participation events, you can imagine if you're trying to recruit volunteers on the day of your events and you don't give them food and you don't give them shelter and you don't let them park nearby and they can't get through security, it's going to be tough recruiting next year to get help. And so it's desirable during the event to provide these things. We try to get like all access passes and food and shelter. And I think that the reality is also you'll get your members to come back every year and help out, especially if you take care of them. And care for the caregiver cannot be just like some meaningless term. I mean, you may actually have a volunteer code somebody. And I would just note that, that's a great place to have a mental health EAP. Again, not just for the runners or athletes, but for your caregivers. We have to take care of ourselves. And so maybe the word sanitation really should have a broader usage here. Let's do the next slide, Andy. Thank you. So we've gone through we've done EAP, pre, and during. Now we're going to do post. Think about the things you would do after event. You're going to get feedback. You're going to elicit, an email or have a discussion of how things went. Going to collect those comments and review them. And that means you may have to change what you do next year from what you hear from your teammates. And I think that also is not just what you do, but what you have. That could be more help. That could be different equipment. And so post events, the next chapter in the update that we want to focus on. And so Andy, take us to the next slide here. So post event, there are essential recommendations, essentials red. And so think about the end of your day, you finished your tennis tournament for the 3 days. Let's wrap up that documentation. Someone went into SVT or something, or had to be transported because of heat stroke. They're probably going to ask for their records later. And this is your opportunity to have a medical legal record, and obviously providing feedback to the medical director if you aren't the medical director. And certainly if you are the medical director, you've got to basically kind of pull this data together and analyze it and give a report. And we do that every year. It's very helpful. I mean, we can say, hey, look, we had 10,000 runners. We treated 250. We transported 7. Here's exactly why. It's just really an absolute essential for covering these kind of mass gatherings. Next slide, Andy. Desirable. I mean, I think if you can participate in the review of the medical care and the administrative plan, that'd be outstanding. And really, I think that it's really nice if you can, do a little after action meeting, not just with your medical team, but with the race director or the tournament director. Talk to your fire EMS. They're going to have a perspective, and it's important you get that. And if you find you need more ambulances or another aid tender on the course or more hydration on a multi-day tournament, this is often where that comes out. And if you need more equipment, like you need to add a sodium analyzer or crutches or a wheelchair, these are often the times where you can make the case for it because you've got that data. Next slide. Very important. I always think that, all mass participation events need to have, early access to defibrillation. But there's other things you're going to need. Again, 911 is not an EAP. It is not the plan. We're going to actually have to go through and say, what do I expect to run into? And, obviously for a lot of the world, we're getting warmer. Here in Maryland, we had a lot of 100-degree days this summer. So if I had an event, I have a source of water, source of ice. What's my cooling method? What if there's something goes boom? There's a mass casualty event. Do I have what I need? Do I have tourniquets? Do I have quick clot? The equipment matters. And so you have to think about these things as well post-race. Let's do the next slide, Andy. So the next topic they touch base on, again, they've done like EAP, pre, during, post, is just your equipment and supplies. And the essential thing is to have early access to AED because electricity saves lives. And then you have to know what you need for your ecosystem, right? Like, again, think about the low bit. I'm probably not going to see too many heat strokes there. If you're there, you might have to have a plan to warm someone up. And then you have to collaborate with your event administrator. And it's desirable, to talk about what equipment needs you have, because sometimes they'll be able to bring an AED to augment yours. And then desired if you can be involved, with the decision of how you're going to distribute various things on the course and medical supplies. How are they going to get there? It's one thing to say I have like a whole bunch of rectal thermometers, but if they're all at the finish line tent, how am I going to distribute them onto the course the day of a race, for example? Let's do the next slide here, Andy, and we'll talk about our next topic. The next chapter they really talk about, it segues nicely from equipment, is the medical services. It's a very broad topic, but no matter what kind of tournament you're covering, your staffing for medical areas is key. Who's going to be there and what kind? Are they RNs, PTs, ATCs? Are we having advanced care practitioners join us? Who's the medical director? Who's the operations director? Do we have, everything we need as far as fluid and nutrition replacement? And so you need to get the medical operations team to assess the environmental conditions and respond to that. And then you need a communications plan. Now, many times that's going to be a mobile phone or texting. But sometimes that's going to be something else. Like if there is a mass casualty event, those cell phone towers will be turned off. And so, that's just a public safety thing that'll happen. So do you have radios as a backup or your primary? Are they 800 radios? Can they go through the thick walls of where your emergency operations command center is? Or do you have ham radios? Or do you have medical apps like ones you can text, or, there's ones that are like almost like Wi-Fi? And essentially, you want to just know what that is ahead of time and what your backup plan is. And then you also just have to understand your options to determine who's going to go back into playing. And what does that mean? Well, you can imagine if someone stops at a first aid tent on the course, how do you determine if they're going to be okay to continue? And having that policy ahead of time is key. Well, that could be different for a lacrosse tournament with a concussion. But you have to understand your options available. Next slide, Andy. And so if you're the medical director, remember, they're going to break out some other essential recommendations and such. If you're the medical director, they want you to be part of the medical team that's part of event management. And again, modification happens. We've seen races have to cancel. We've had races move. Why does that happen? Well, things happen. Weather happens. Natural disasters occur. You have to know what your options are if you're the medical director. And putting together your ops team is critical, because you can't really do everything on a huge tournament day if you're the medical director. You actually need to be able to direct. If you have been the medical director and you've retired, helping out by doing like lifting, like doing the heat deck, or running like the cardiac care unit in one of the medical tents, that can allow your medical director to actually direct, because there's just a lot of stuff coming to them. And so as your medical director, get that team together, put someone in charge of all your nursing, have someone bring, the athletic trainers, and, let's prep them with a lecture a week before, tell them where they're going to be, and have like some, leadership there in case there's something wrong. It comes through the leadership and not having 5 people come to you at once. And then you're in charge. So you have to actually educate the on-site medical team, which we do not just a week before the race with emails and then lectures, but there's actually kind of Zoom meetings we'll do. And then the day of, we actually go through the protocols as well. All of these are essential. They really ensure you'll have a safer day. Let's do the next slide. And again, for medical services, there are some desirable things. It'd be nice to say the medical director has the authority to do whatever they want, but in this world, they often don't. But it'd be nice and desirable if they had the authority to cancel or postpone for medical situations, and to determine who will return to play. These are medical decisions, and you should have that desired ability to go in and have an effect on that decision. And again, if there's heat or cold, those environmental conditions are being monitored. Again, we use the wet bulb globe thermistors at races, for example, and that determines, are we going to take a break? Are we going to have more hydration at this, 3-day lacrosse event? And we want to, again, desirably, get together and we'll say, this is exactly who can go back to play. And if you publish that ahead of time, it goes so much better, right? It just makes your life easier when you don't have to contest a decision. Can you say, look, we posted this a while ago. It was on your sign up page. So, make your life easier. Next slide, Andy. All right. The next segment or chapter in the update talks about environment and security. And so, you can't control weather. You can't control all hazards, but you do have to be able to anticipate and plan for some things. And so it's essential that your medical operations team, can do these things. What are your environmental hazards you should think about? Well, temperature, altitude, pollution. What surface are you on? Lightning or natural disasters. And then do you have a plan if there is terrorism? I think you have to think about these things ahead of time. And that means you're going to be coordinating with your local medical and disaster management services, even if that means you're at a meeting and they say, you're going to do what we tell you to do. Like, we often will meet with the police or some federal agencies and they say, we can't share with you all the data. But if we come into the tent to the incident command and tell everyone to stay put, that's going to be the plan. And that's fine. If they develop that ahead of time and we understand that, we can communicate that, that's the plan. If the plan is to, run, hide, or fight, or are we going to stay and assist local municipal authorities because we're medical in an area where there might be people hurt? Getting that ahead of time and understanding the importance of coordinating that is absolutely key. And again, as we look at all those things, whether it's temperature, altitude, weather, other hazards, security threats, how are we going to modify or cancel? Where's our bailout point? Do you have a point where you can say, you know what, everyone go to your cars, there's lightning? Or is there a large area where we can shelter? Or if we don't want people coming to the finish line of a marathon, is there 2 or 3 parks that you can just kind of offload a few thousand people into because you can't have them come downtown for whatever reason? All essential things. Andy, let's go to the next slide. Desirable, publishing, those condition protocols in advance, again, making your life easier. I always encourage the race director to discuss what to do with lightning or acts of God and put that on their webpage. Cancellation policies on the webpage are great. And just saying, look, okay, we have lightning. It's going to be 30 minutes from the last strike. Or are we using a lightning monitor in this case? Post that online. It just reduces the amount of work you have to do when that situation occurs. And then again, developing to coordinate the environmental, hazard security threat planning. That means sometimes you're sitting down with folks that you haven't seen at, internal medicine rounds, because these are municipal, workers whose speciality is, making the city or town or county you're in work. Well, it's really desirable if you can get in front of them well before your race and just talk to them. Say, well, what if there's a car that jumps the curb and hits somebody? They'll know, they have plans, but you may not know them. And if you don't have that communication, you can't, it's not telepathy. You can't read their mind and they can't read yours. So you need to develop a modification or cancellation plan. It's desirable to do that. I think it's always nice to have a backup plan. They always say 2 plans is 1 plan. So why not, be prepared? Next slide, Andy. We have another Dr. Eric Omley citing here. So desirable for medical ops, we want to assess the environmental conditions throughout and just make sure we can modify if we need to. But we want to include medical staff with disaster management experience. So we're showing Eric here. He's one of our EM specialists, and he's been the director of operations for Baltimore Marathon for many years before others took over. And My background is family medicine. And so, I don't work in the emergency department. So I need to grab people with that speciality and help me for my events. My general sense is here that he's going to ask me the question, do you have tourniquets? Do you have hemorrhage control supplies? Are they nearby? And then, when you practice your EAP, it's one thing to say, oh, I have the supplies. It's desirable to have, this disaster management experience. Open up those kits. I can't tell you how many times we'll open up a tourniquet supply and the tourniquet's still in its little plastic wrapper. And you can imagine having gloves on, covered with blood, trying to open those plastic wrappers. It's difficult. So pre-open them. But, enroll people who know how to do some very, maybe like not common things you would think about at a mass gathering event, like people who know how to teach and then put on applying tourniquets or hemostatic dressings. When was the last time we thought about doing a jaw thrust or a chin lift at a mass gathering sports event? What about needle decompression? Or can we start IV fluids if we wanted to, if we needed to, for someone who needed fluid resuscitation? And then, can I stabilize the neck? Can I be prepared for disaster management? Well, yeah, I can talk to people who do this a lot. We have folks who do fellowships in EMS. Uh, you're not alone. Like, reach out to the folks who are specialized in this area and augment your team. Next slide. Okay, the next chapter, we'll shifting gears to a lighter portion of the talk, since we've just talked about, having to do March protocol. We're going to turn to hydration. And, if you look at the role of hydration, it's kind of sometimes surprising we have to talk about this because you would think it's rather simple, but you need to be involved and understand the role of having fluid availability at your event and also energy replacement. And you also have to know and recognize what is hyponatremia. And mass participation events need equipment to treat these things, whether that is salty chips, hot salty broth or soup, or 3% hypertonic saline, and maybe a sodium or glucose measurement device for some of the things you'll need to do here. I always think hyponatremia kind of lurks in areas where recovery zones occur with cramping, headaches, nausea, persistent vague things. But you have to recall it can be deadly with seizures and such. So recognizing those signs and symptoms, and of course, we always touch base on this the day of our event, but to educate folks. And you have to understand the fluid energy replacement plans are individualized. And people say, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But imagine you're actually putting on a massive kids run. Well, kids are not little adults, they're not small adults, they're actually, pediatric patients. So they have specific fluid needs. And maybe it might be special risk for heat because of their body weight ratio. And what if you're covering the Wounded Warrior Games? What if you have individuals with a lot of burns on their skin and they can't sweat? So individualizing fluid energy replacement is key. And again, it would seem like a basic thing just to make hydration available, but it's also kind of concerning how bad advice, how much is out there. So you can be really the person backing recommendations with science. Let's do the next slide. So desirable actions, where are we going to put the hydration? For our marathons, we try to put it every 5 kilometers. And we don't want to put too much water on the course. There was that very sad story a few years ago of someone who drank almost 2 gallons of water and they were found dead. And this wasn't even a race. This was someone just trying to win a video game console in California. So you have to control sometimes where you're going to put the locations of hydration and fuel replacement. And then asking your race director or tournament director to publish that, right? So help your race director, because they don't sometimes understand what hyponatremia is. And really too few hydration areas or refreshment stands, you're going to have people with dehydration. That's going to lead to poor thermoregulation and maybe even more heat illnesses and decreased performance. Conversely, novice athletes, you give them too much water, they'll probably hyperhydrate. So you have to be cautious. Next slide, Andy. And then confirm that you actually have like what you need on the course. It's always interesting to me that, every time I see a commercial, they say understand that the temperature and the composition of your fluids is desirable. I've never seen a commercial for a drink that says it tastes bad. And usually it's cold and icy. And basically you want to confirm that you have a cool temperature, beverage, something between 60 and 72 Fahrenheit is great. little bit more of good taste and favorable, palatable, is always beneficial. So people actually enjoy it. Because if you actually put a drink at your tournament that people can't stand, they're not going to drink it. Again, they'll get dehydrated, their thermoregulation goes down, their performance goes down, and it's a problem. And you have to make sure there's salt and carbohydrates during your event as well. That's desirable because you can then talk to your race director about, where we're going to put that on the course and then publish it. Next slide. More desirable actions. Blue is desirable on these slides, recall. So you really want to educate against too much or too little of hydration and fuel. And so part of that is blowing that out and making sure your athletes are aware of what hyponatremia is. And so remember, just generally, I always tell them it's really excessive fluid intake is the primary mechanism. And you can educate, hyponatremia is a kind of scary word. It makes me feel like I'm on, rounds again, and I have to calculate kidney function equations. But you can educate your athletes and your staff really easily just by saying, look, this is just too much free water. And then also really encouraging people to understand how sweating is crucial for thermoregulation. Like when you're athletes and you're sweating, that's mostly how you're going to control your body temperature. And as you lose more and more water, you get underhydrated, and that can be dangerous. So I ask people to try to look at sweat losses, and that can sometimes mean just for individually measuring pre and post exercise weight. And then you take into account the fluid intake and subtracting your urine output. Some people might not do that, but for us who work with elite athletes, they follow this very closely because anything they can do to make sure their performance is peak is key. But in general, if people are losing 2% of their body weight, they can't control their thermoregulation optimally. And so calculating sweat losses is important for athletes. And that way you can ensure the proper hydration and electrolyte replacement during training and competition. I'll just throw in here one other thing. I always ask, even though it's not on the desirable list here we see, how much alcohol will be available to my athletes? It's a factor in dehydration, as well as other possible negative sequelae. We also had a race where the beer tent stole all of our ice for a tent at the finish line on a hot day. So hydration is a key topic. And while these are the desirable recommendations, having those conversations as you plan your tournament or your mass gathering event is key. Andy, next slide. So one of our last of our two topics, chapters, segments of the update is recovery. And I think too often recovery is seen as one more corner to cut. I think the TPCC mass participation update kind of leans into the importance of recovery and decreasing injury and improving performance as an essential action for the team physician. But I would say that, this is actually a correction here, Andy, we got the wrong slides. This should be a red because essential should be red. So warning there. We'll have to change that later make a note of that. But it's essential action for the team physicians. And so recovery is, remember, I try to tell my athletes, recovery is that period and process during which the body responds to load. So you actually get better from resting, which we don't see a lot of in our world of overuse. So apologies on the wrong color here on this slide. Next slide, please. So when we look at the desirable things, how do we teach our athletes or our coaches and parents that recovery is key? I think you have to normalize downtime, whether that's off seasons or avoiding sports specialization. At marathons, we actually label a physical therapy tent as a recovery zone. There are anti-gravity chairs, there's massage options, there's foam rollers, there's manual therapy, there's stretching offered. We have very large signs and educational posts pre-race, and we make announcements about the recovery zone. Post-race, we mention that there's these recovery options as they finish line shoot, and we post a ton of social media, sometimes with like professional runners or athletes performing recovery by hydrating and resting. I mean, there's published evidence out there with, the risk of injuries associated with sports specialization, but this is really a desired action, but really key. You have to understand that hydration and nutrition are part of recovery. Sleep and rest are important. That includes mental rest. And I think the active and passive recovery stations are kind of a nice way to draw people in to some of your events. And that way you can incorporate it into your event. I think it's an opportunity to educate. It's just like we tell people not to, train more hours than their age for our, athletes who are young. I think we're trying to push into these mass gathering events the idea of recovery. That's a key topic. Next slide. All right, we're here at the last chapter. We made it. So the sports-specific considerations. I got the color right. These are red. So lastly, the update speaks to mass participation with duration and repetition. And so certain activities, will have pitch counts, innings played, match or tournament duration limitations. So they kind of break a lot of those sports into three categories. So you have the endurance sports, which I've talked about a lot because, of course, I'm the director of running medicine, but those are, your marathons, your triathlons, your ultra marathons. And so you have to be like thinking of those will have things like exercise associated collapse. And that's the different kind of frequency of injury and type. You'll see rhabdo, you'll see ECAS, which is that exercise collapse associated with sickle cell trait. You got to be ready for cardiac arrest. Whereas if you're dealing with other categories, maybe collision or contact sports like rugby, American football, lacrosse, these injuries have more fractures or cervical spine or head injuries, or specifically thinking about concussion too. What devices do you need equipment wise to prevent that? Right. So sports specific policies, protocols to reduce, injury. Well, do we need to have particular things to wear? And then, do you wear like a vest to prevent commotio cordis? Do you have an AED available? Because early defibrillation we've talked about is key. And just think about also the repetitive motion sports, which is the third category, which is like baseball, softball, tennis, swimming. These sports get injuries from overuse. So you think about USTA like limits daily match time with mandatory rest periods, and for baseball, softball, there's pitch counts well documented. USA Swimming tries to get a match in within 8 hours too. So all these things are key. Let's do the next slide here, Andy. Desirable. There are rules that we just talked about, sports-specific rules. And I think that really what we want to make sure is that we recognize and manage those high acuity, low occurrence events, sometimes called halo events. I stole that from Dr. Corey Hudson, who works for the NBA. And then there's just the stuff you have to be aware of that's low acuity and you see all the time. Ankle sprains. Are you going to be prepared for that? And then we talked about protective equipment. Okay, you're going to wear a helmet to reduce skull fractures. Great. You're going to have chest protectors to prevent commotio cordis, mouth guards to protect teeth. You have to understand those, and that's desirable. But you also have to know how to remove those equipment if you need to. If we're in an American football game, we got to remove both helmet and pads. It's both or none. And those helmets are different for ice hockey than for American football and lacrosse. So you have to understand those things. All desirable points. Next slide, Andy. All right, guys, we survived. The bottom line. So the mass participation TPCC update from 2022 really emphasized the necessity of a comprehensive and pre-coordinated medical plan. And the key recommendations which we touched base on include developing and implementing an EAP or emergency action plan, and integrating the medical team with local EMS, and then assessing specific event risks and ensuring rapid care and communication for all your venues. I think the statement really behooves us to establish clear medical protocols, many of which have already been done, and you can beg, borrow, and steal those and then modify what you need. And there's also a need for robust communication and a backup plan for that. And then transport systems for emergencies, not only for your athletes, but to consider how your activity may affect the community. I think ultimately these measures aim to help you optimize your patient, care and safety. And I appreciate the opportunity tonight to talk to you guys about this, and would like to open up the floor for questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sedgley, for the awesome talk. There is going to be an evaluation to kind of be filled out. That's going to be dropped on the chat in a few seconds or minutes. If you have any questions, please type that in the chat function, and I will post that question to Dr. Sedgley. While the questions are coming on, I will kind of get started. What do you think are some of the qualifications or training of a medical director? What are some of the background knowledge, information, licensing, things of such nature you think they should have?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think when we look at qualifications, I mean, one of the big things is I like to have someone who's experienced. Experience is experience. And so, look at how I got into marathon medicine. As an intern, I volunteered with Dr. Bill Roberts at, he was just running the Twin Cities Marathon. He's like, I just need someone to help me out with the chute. Can you run people in with a wheelchair? And I got that experience. And then by the next year, they pulled me into the main finish line tent. They said, okay, this section yours. And the next year, they put me in charge of a tent on the course. And, within a few years, I actually had someone come to me and say, hey, we'd like you to be a medical director of a race. I think you have to grow your experience. And so I would encourage people who are interested in being medical directors to try to get that experience. What's really neat is a lot of the races that are huge welcome a lot of folks to volunteer. Even if you don't have like a massive marathon at your program, it doesn't mean you can't get the experience. Although I would, say that many times you'll find just by doing the fellowship, you're going to be far more experienced and knowledgeable than some folks who are actually currently the medical directors. And that's not a knock on them. It's just there's only so many fellowship, spots. Like there's a limited number of us. And as we grow as a subspecialty, I think it really behooves us to join into some of these events and give them our time and our talent, so we can increase the safety not only of the athletes but the communities the events are in.
I do have a second follow-up question on that. You mentioned earlier in terms of organizing your team, you mentioned maybe depending on what specialty you are, having an EM physician. What should you look for in a medical team when you're creating it? What are some of your recommendation advice on that?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. So I am surrounded by really smart emergency medicine physicians. When we had a race I worked in a private practice in Stillwater, Minnesota. I reached out to the regional trauma center. The medical director there was at the time RJ Fresconi, and I met with him and I said, "Look, I'm going to need some help. I'm going to need to be able to talk to EMS. I'm going to need your assistance in not just communication, but how our transport's going to go." So I like never being alone. If I was to put on a massive event with a large pediatric group as a family medicine doctor, I'm pretty comfortable with that. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't reach out to my peds sports medicine folks by email and say, look at my EAP. What am I missing? I don't think we're ever alone in this game. I love the fact that I'm maybe 14 years out of fellowship, and I still email my mentors, and I'm like, what am I missing here? And so I don't think that it hurts to reach out, phone a friend, and don't be afraid to take some critique and see if they can improve what you're doing, and that's okay. I mean, that's how we make things better.
No, that's awesome. Thank you. I encourage you guys, if you have any specific questions, drop it on the chart. Otherwise, I just want to thank you all for attending this talk today. We'll look forward to, it looks like there is a question. What's a comment?
So
Um,
that's Dr. Sasser, who's one of my EM specialists I was just bragging about, and we work together on many many situations, including the Ravens stadium where he's in charge of event medicine. So it's great to surround yourselves with smart people. It makes you look smart.
Once again, thank you very much. And I appreciate Dr. Sedgley for joining today. Thank you very much. And everybody have a good night.
Thanks for having me.